History as it happens, March 25th, 2021. Understanding capitalism.
We are living in many ways in a socialist society right now. Problem is, as Dr. Martin Luther King reminded us, we have socialism for the very rich, rugged individualism for the poor.
You don't have to totally agree with Bernie Sanders to see there might be something wrong with American capitalism. Faith in free markets and low taxes uneasily coexists with stagnant wages and yawning inequality. What would Adam Smith say? That's next as we report History as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
So far as poverty is concerned, there has never in history been a more effective machine for eliminating poverty than the free enterprise system and the free market.
Hey everybody, you know those Democratic primary debates way before the pandemic? Did you ever think you'd see an American politician running for president, proudly defending democratic socialism and being applauded for it? Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont basically said enough of this socialism is scary stuff as he offered a full-throated defense of a larger welfare state.
Wait a second. Let me finish. When Donald Trump gets $800 million in tax breaks and subsidies to build luxury condominiums, that's socialism for the rich. When Walmart, we have to subsidize Walmart's workers who are on Medicaid and food stamps because the wealthiest family in America pays starvation wages. That's socialism for the rich. I believe in democratic socialism for working people.
Now, who is the other voice you heard at the beginning of this episode?
There's no case for the government whatsoever in mandating airbags, because airbags protect the people inside the car. That's my business. If I want to protect myself, I should do it at my expense.
Milton Friedman, probably the 20th century's most prominent advocate of free markets, the author of Capitalism and Freedom, a very influential book published in 1962. It would seem Sanders and Friedman sit pretty far apart on the economic spectrum, socialism versus capitalism, but as we'll get into today, it's not that simple. Remember, before the pandemic engulfed everything, we were having a debate of sorts in this country about these competing economic systems, and it was long overdue. As we've discussed on this podcast before, younger Americans find socialism or socialist-sounding policies like universal health care more appealing than any generation in memory. A good many Americans were looking around at the devastation wrought by two economic upheavals, the '08 crash and the pandemic, and saying, you know, what American capitalism has become isn't working so well. Stagnant wages, astronomical childcare costs, unfulfilling jobs, to name three, while capitalist dogma exalted limited government, low taxes, supply-side economics, the rollback of regulation of private industry in the financial sector, the decline of labor unions, and on and on.
I'm very uncomfortable with the notion that capitalism necessarily means anything about the level of tax rates or with the presence or absence of redistributive programs or the level of regulation, something like that. Let's go back to Adam Smith, for example. Adam Smith was in favor of progressive income taxes. Adam Smith was in favor of tighter regulation on banks than anything you or I have known.
That's a different Friedman, Harvard economist Benjamin Friedman, no relation to Milton. He's our guest today, the author of a fascinating new book, Religion and the Rise of Capitalism. We're going to speak to him about capitalism's current crisis and that debate we started with, capitalism versus socialism. But it's really a false choice. For instance, back in 2019, CNBC had legendary investor Warren Buffett on, and he was asked about this growing criticism of capitalism as an election year approached. Here's some of what he said, courtesy CNBC.
I don't think people exactly even know what they're talking about. It isn't that capitalism is perfect, but if you look at what was here in 1776 and look at what is here now, this country has done an incredible job in terms of the deployment of resources and human ingenuity. That is a product of a system.
So how would you define the American system? Indulge me for a moment here because I read something a couple of years ago that stuck in my head, and I think of it whenever this socialism versus capitalism debate comes up. In their book, These United States, A Nation in the Making, 1890 to the Present, historians Glenda Gilmore and Thomas Agru wrote, "The rise and success of American high-tech industries did not result from tax cuts and deregulation. In fact, no American industries relied more on government spending than did computing, electrical engineering, and communications equipment. Between 1982 and 1988, federal research and development spending nearly doubled. By decade's end, 40% of all research and development in the computing industry was federally funded. Nearly half of communications technology research, including the systems that were the basis of the Internet, came from the federal government." The point here is maybe American capitalism works best when private industry and government work in tandem. It's not one or the other. People who consider themselves capitalists accept government subsidies. Supporting higher taxes doesn't make you a commie. Enough out of me. Let's hear from someone who will definitely enlighten this discussion. Benjamin Friedman is the William Joseph Mayer Professor of Political Economy at Harvard. He's taught there nearly half a century, and his new book is Religion and the Rise of Capitalism. Benjamin Friedman, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. I'm happy to be with you.
The coronavirus pandemic seemed to expose or exacerbate long-running problems. For instance, the yawning gap between the wealthy and ordinary wage earners, the lack of economic security faced by so many Americans. Not quite like what my grandmother went through during the Great Depression, but bad enough. Do you agree with this assessment? What's your thinking here?
I do, although the period in American history to which I would point is not the Great Depression, but the period in the 1880s, 1890s, and on into the new first decades of the new century. This was a period of very rapid economic growth for the most part, but a great surprise to people is that lots of Americans were not participating. And there was a widespread sense of poverty, especially in American cities. A famous economist of the time, Henry George, wrote a book called Progress and Poverty. We don't react to that title today, but the idea of linking progress and poverty was a shocking new idea when the book came out right around 1880. And through the remainder of the 19th century and on into the 20th, there was a major dispute in America, not just echoed, but led within the country's Protestant establishment. There were a group of people within the Protestant churches who became identified with something called the social gospel, who wanted the government to undertake a kind of program to come to the aid of people who were being left behind and who were in poverty in the midst of all this economic advance. I think that's where we are today, and I would not be surprised if we started to have the kind of split in the religious establishment today that we did then. There was a group that called themselves the social gospel, and there was a different group often called the gospel of wealth. None of them thought that economic progress was a bad thing. They all thought it was terrific. The issue was whether people were being left behind or not, and if so, who was supposed to do what about it. I think we're in roughly the same position today that we were then. It was a major debate in American society that went on for several decades. I wouldn't be surprised if we had that going forward throughout the 2020s and on into the 2030s.
The Occupy Wall Street protests that rose up after the crash of 2008 brought the issue of income inequality to the fore, and I sense that people started to feel more comfortable questioning capitalism, which kind of has a quasi-religious following in the United States. But as it's practiced here, it has become synonymous with very low taxes, low levels of regulation, especially of the financial sector, an emphasis on satisfying shareholders instead of, say, workers and collective bargaining rights. Why do you think that is? And do you even agree with that framing?
I'm very uncomfortable with the notion that capitalism necessarily means anything about the level of tax rates or with the presence or absence of redistributive programs or the level of regulation, something like that. Let's go back to Adam Smith, for example. Adam Smith was in favor of progressive income taxes. Adam Smith was in favor of tighter regulation on banks than anything you or I have known within our lifetime in the United States. Adam Smith was in favor of luxury taxes. So, for example, Smith thought that people who ride around in luxury carriages ought to pay a luxury tax on that. So think of it as if Adam Smith was calling for people who ride around in BMWs and Mercedeses today to pay a luxury tax on them. And moreover, he was explicit that he thought the revenue from the tax should go to alleviate poverty. So I don't think there's anything in capitalism that is necessarily connected with any of the things that you mentioned. Now, we happen to be in a position in which many people today attach a kind of religious value to things like low taxes and absence of regulation and the like. Part of the challenge of what I take up in my new book is why that's so. And I think there are distinct religious antecedents to modern economic thinking that have led many Americans in that direction. But there's nothing particular about capitalism per se that leads us there. We can have capitalism with low taxes, capitalism with high taxes. Actually, capitalism can't survive without a certain level of regulation, because the whole point of capitalism is market competition. And if you don't have antitrust regulation, then you don't have competition in markets. I think you're probably right about the association in many people's minds today, but I'm very uncomfortable with it. I think it just isn't well based.
You mentioned Adam Smith there. He sounded like Bernie Sanders.
Well,
A socialist.
I'm not sure what Smith would have said about Senator Sanders. It would be very interesting to ask Senator Sanders what he thinks about Adam Smith. He's a very well-educated man. I bet he's read Smith's writings. But it is absolutely true that Smith was in favor of things like luxury taxes and progressive income taxes and bank regulation and all that. Smith was even in favor of whiskey taxes and taxes on distilleries. That's pretty bold stuff for somebody who lived in Scotland. So Smith was a remarkably flexible thinker. And the reason for that, and it goes to your question about capitalism, the reason is that Smith did not think of the competitive market mechanism, what we're calling capitalism, as some kind of hothouse, fragile flower that had to be protected against any conceivable encroachments. The thrust of his writing was how robust, how strong this mechanism was, and how, therefore, if there was something that would be an infringement on market competition or on free markets, and if there was a valid public purpose for it, well, Smith's view was go forward.
We're having a debate, if we can call it that, in this country right now about capitalism and socialism, as if it has to be all one or all the other. It came up during the presidential election, the Democratic primary contests. I've noted that polls show younger people are more comfortable with socialistic or socialist-sounding policies than older generations. The COVID relief bill ignited the debate because it contained some big anti-poverty measures. Where do you stand in all this?
I would try to avoid using the phrases capitalism and socialism to describe this debate. Nobody that I know of is resisting the idea of capitalism in the sense of competitive markets where the competitors are largely privately owned firms. Nobody is favoring socialism in the classic sense of government ownership of the means of production. So right away, these terms are not descriptive of what we're having. The second point to make is that nobody is trying to push us all the way to one end of the spectrum or other. Think about the COVID relief bill under Trump. The business establishment did not oppose the bailout for Boeing. The business establishment did not oppose the $50 billion that went to the airlines. Again and again and again, businesses are very willing to accept handouts from the government when it seems to be necessary. So I think we all should understand that we live in what economists like to call a mixed economy. We have a competitive market system, but we have a heavy overlay of government regulation, of government redistribution, of taxes, of welfare programs. And nobody that I know is proposing to move all the way to one end of the spectrum or to the other end of the spectrum. We have a very healthy debate about where on the spectrum we should be. I think that's a good thing. I hope we always have a debate going about where on the spectrum we should be. And from wherever we are at the moment, there will always be people who want to push in one direction, people who want to push in the other direction. I think that's good. That's what we should be doing.
As you say, though, many times these words become politicized or their meanings become garbled. For instance, when the Democrats were debating democratic socialism, I was talking about the Democratic primary debates, there was a dozen candidates on the stage, and whether democratic socialism is somehow at odds with capitalism. No one mentioned that, the European democratic socialist model worked within a global capitalist economy over the second half of the 20th century, and that democratic socialist parties in Europe weren't Marxist anymore. But I suppose on a debate stage with everyone yelling at each other, it's hard to make those points.
I think that's part of what I'm driving at. Germany, for example, has a party called the Social Democratic Party, I think is a better translation from the German. It is not in the favor of government ownership of the means of production. What they mean by that is precisely what you were meaning and what I was saying a moment ago. That party would like to push Germany along the spectrum from where it is in the direction of more redistribution of the product of the economy using the tax and welfare system in the direction of more regulation. And that's fine, but I don't think of that as socialism. That's the name of the party. And similarly, other parties want to move in the opposite direction, but I don't think there's any party in Germany or any other European country, no more than there is in the United States, that wants to get rid of all government interference or to get rid of all regulation.
It sounds like you agree with the argument that we need some reform these days. Let's take a look at, for instance, the debate over the minimum wage, to raise it to a federal minimum wage of $15 phased in over several years. And this, too, is getting caught up in these debates we've been discussing, where there's almost always more heat than light.
You're pointing to one of the most interesting areas in which the view of economists have changed in recent years. If you and I were having this conversation 25 years ago, I don't know what you would have thought, but I at least would have talked about how economists are convinced that significant increases in the minimum wage will lead to lots of workers losing their jobs because somebody who's working for $10 an hour is worth it at $10 an hour and might not be worth it at $12 an hour. Economists don't say that much anymore because new economic research over the last quarter century has pretty well undermined that view. It's not that we know that there aren't people who will lose their jobs. It's just that we don't know that there are. I would say there's virtually no serious evidence to which economists would point these days that would tell us one way or another what's going to happen if we put the minimum wage to $15. Now, precisely for that reason, I have to say I'm a little bit sorry that we seem likely to do this at the federal level, because one of the great advantages I always think of our federal system in the United States is that different states can do different things and states can learn from what they do. So we might put our minimum wage at $15 in Massachusetts, and the nice people in Connecticut might hold back and say, well, that's very interesting, but let's see what actually happens as a result in Massachusetts before we go that route. So I have to admit to you that I was hoping we would take that approach for the minimum wage. Now, we may still, although it looks increasingly likely that Congress will enact a $15 minimum wage proposal, and if so, I'm sure President Biden will sign it. But to be very clear, my reason for disappointment is not that I have any basis for knowing that it's harmful. I don't know that. Economists have no evidence in one side or another. Simply sorry that we're sacrificing the opportunity to do this in a way that will allow one state to experiment and another state to learn from what the experimenting state does.
Well, there's that old saying, I don't know if anyone actually ever said this, that a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. And the Democratic Party in Congress and in the White House with President Biden seem to be acting on that now. That for too long, we've had these inequities in our capitalist system. The virus exposed them. So before the midterm elections, let's try to get some progressive legislation through.
I think that's a fair characterization of where we are. And in many respects, I think it's a reaction to what happened after the last crisis. I'm referring to the financial crisis of 2008, 9, 10, around there. It was very interesting. Not long ago, I read President Obama's recent memoir. It was interesting to me, as a mostly financial economist, to see what he said about the financial reform bill, the Dodd-Frank Act, which Congress passed in 2010. President Obama, looking back, I think recognizes that the reform we enacted was way too cautious, way too small. It's not that there was anything wrong specifically with the Dodd-Frank bill. I poke holes in a few items. I don't agree with everything that was in it. But the main point is that here we had the worst financial crisis that the United States had experienced in 2 generations. And what we got in the way of reform in financial regulation was very small stuff compared to the magnitude of the crisis. And I think the Democrats now realize, and President Obama pretty much comes out and says the same thing in his memoir, that they made a mistake by going so slowly in this period when he first took office in 2009 on into 2010, where there was a real sense of urgency in the economy. The Democrats had, at that time, pretty large majorities in the Congress. My sense is that they're today eager not to repeat that mistake. They understand that there's some sense of urgency. Today, it's not a matter of having large majorities versus small majorities. They're starting with small majorities. They may lose those majorities altogether in the next election or the next time some senator dies. So I think the reaction on the Democratic side is pretty understandable.
And I think they argue that people want these policies. So, Benjamin Friedman of Harvard, your new book, Religion and the Rise of Capitalism. You go back to the days of Calvinism among Protestant sects to explain that capitalism doesn't have purely secular roots.
Yes, that's right. The standard story for where my discipline, economics, came from is that it was a product of the Enlightenment. People like Adam Smith and David Hume lived in Scotland in the mid to late 18th century, and they were certainly figures of the Enlightenment. All that's true enough, but then the usual presumption is that because economics is a product of the Enlightenment, religion therefore has nothing to do with it. And I think that's wrong. I think the changes in religious thinking that were underway right when people like Smith and Hume were coming into young adulthood and therefore forming their view of the world were powerfully influential in shaping how they viewed the world and therefore how they came up with the economic thinking that they did. And you're right to mention Calvinism, although in the opposite direction. What I concluded after doing my work on this is that it was the movement away from predestinarian Calvinism that created a new and more benign, more optimistic view of the human character, and most important, a more expansive view of the possibilities of human choice and human action. I think that's what enabled Adam Smith to come to the sense that he did of how competitive markets work.
Because under Calvinism, and I'm certainly no expert on it, you were damned from the start. You didn't have free will, or at least the ability to change your fate in the long run. As you mentioned, Adam Smith and the other thinkers came along and said, no, actually, we can do things differently and improve the human condition. Am I getting that right?
Well, almost, almost right. I would be very careful about saying that the Calvinists thought there was no free will. What they didn't think people had the ability to do was to influence whether they were saved in the afterlife, or alternatively, whether they were condemned to an eternity of punishment. And of course, for Calvinist believers, contemplating this eternity of either being in heaven or in this pretty unpleasant place, that was a very important matter. Calvin was very clear, and his followers accepted, that this decision of whether you or I are going to be saved or go to an eternity of punishment is a decision made not only before we're born, but even before the world was created in the first place. And that therefore left no room for anything that you and I decide, nothing that we do, nothing that we think has an ability to influence our salvation. And I think this Calvinist attitude that nothing we do or choose can make better things happen in that sense spilled over into the secular world. And by contrast, by the time Smith and Hume and their contemporaries are coming along, we're now 200 years after Calvin lived, now people are saying, no, the right religious view is that what you think can influence whether you're saved or not. John Locke had this marvelous metaphor of what he called the candle of the Lord. Nice metaphor, the candle of the Lord. By that he meant human reason that's available to everybody if we will only use it. And another figure of this time, the first Archbishop of Canterbury, appointed in the church after England's glorious revolution in 1688, put it this way, he said, we have the ability to cooperate with God in achieving our salvation. Well, that's a very different view of what we can or cannot do in the religious realm. And I think it's spilled over into Smith's more expansive view of what humans could do in the secular realm. I think that was an important contributor to how he formed his view of the competitive market mechanism that he did.
Well, thank you for correcting me on the Calvinist point in free will. So why is your research and your scholarship on this subject, religion and capitalism, important today? We were talking earlier about how people who arrive at a certain definition of capitalism then say, well, all of our public policies have to follow this definition. So why is your work on this important for our discussions today?
One of the most interesting things that I found in the context of my research is that in America today, people's views on important public policy questions, including in particular economic policy questions, line up surprisingly closely with their religious affiliation and beliefs. I wouldn't have anticipated that, but it turns out to be true. So that if you tell me a person's church or synagogue affiliation, I can come pretty close to telling you, is this person in favor of higher or lower taxes? Is this person in favor of greater or lesser regulation? Is this person in favor of more or less aid from the government to the poor? Now, that initially struck me as pretty surprising, but the more I looked into these religious influences right at the very origins of modern Western economic thinking, I was able to trace a line from these religious ideas of 200 years ago, and then 100 years ago, and then closer than that, trace a line from these religious influences right down to what people of different religious persuasions think today. Now, why is this important and what should we do with it? Look, we live in a democracy. No American is going to look another American in the eye and say, your religious beliefs are wrong, go correct them. We don't do that. But the implication is that if somebody has some economic views that are different from mine, and if I understand that his or her different economic views are different, at least in part because they're anchored in that person's religious views, then that gives me the ability to shape the argument I make and maybe even shape the policies that I'm proposing in order to appeal to that group. So I think there's some practical implications for today that go beyond just the intellectual history that I trace out in the book, although I have to admit I found the intellectual history pretty interesting, and you can't get to the modern practical implications and understand them without going through some of that intellectual history.
Let's wrap up with a question. Is American capitalism in trouble?
I think American capitalism is in trouble for two reasons, at least among others. First, no body of people in a democratic society is ever going to be comfortable with and accept an economic system unless it delivers a degree of what I'll call distributive justice, another good Adam Smith term, unless it delivers a degree of distributive justice with which they are comfortable. And I think we are on a path in which economic inequality, however measured, is becoming wider and wider. I don't know what the limit is, but the trend is clearly unsustainable. So something is going to happen, whether it's a simple matter of economic policy or something within our business structure itself. Something is going to happen to arrest and perhaps even reverse this trend. The second way in which I think our capitalism is in trouble is that, well, to put it simply, we don't take capitalism seriously enough. For example, think about the way our current corporations are governed. In principle, our system of private ownership, and much of that private ownership through large corporations with limited liability and stockholders, implies that the share owners own the company and they are represented by their boards of directors. Well, fine. But look at the current debate over whether the share owners should have any say in what the business managers get paid. Well, at one level, if we take capitalism seriously, there shouldn't be any debate at all. The share owners own the firm. The managers work for them. There's no principle of capitalism that says that a business owner can't decide what to pay his or her employee. But look at the debate that we had, about 10 years ago, I think, in which there was a proposal to put on corporate proxy statements a vote by share owners, even just an advisory vote, not even binding, an advisory vote over whether they liked or didn't like the compensation paid to the top executives. Look at the vigor with which the corporate world resisted that. Well, my sense is that we should have votes like that. They should not just be advisory, they should be binding. In our system, the share owners are the owners of the firm, and they should be able to decide what to pay the people who work for them, so including the top managers of the firm. So I think in many respects, a second failure of our capitalism in America is that we don't take it seriously enough.
Benjamin Friedman of Harvard, thank you for your time today. I never knew Adam Smith and Bernie Sanders had so much in common. On the next episode of History as It Happens, the crisis at the border.
We don't take our advice or counsel from former President Trump on immigration policy, which was not only inhumane, but ineffective over the last 4 years. We're going to chart our own path forward, and that includes treating children with humanity and respect.
Another wave of migrants is reaching the southern border with Mexico, seeking a better life in the United States. What's the answer? We'll take a crack at that question next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.